Ruthless bikers mock a soldier in a diner, his shocking response leaves them frozen. The small roadside diner was exactly the kind of place Edward preferred, quiet, unassuming, and away from the crowds. He had been on the road for hours, the hum of his truck's engine still ringing in his ears as he stepped through the door. The scent of fresh coffee and grilled food filled the air. It was warm, welcoming. Exactly what he needed. Edward, dressed in his military fatigues, made his way toward an empty booth. He carried himself with quiet confidence, not arrogant, just composed. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes, approached with a smile. "Coffee, sweetheart?" Edward nodded. "Black, please." She poured him a steaming cup, and he nodded in thanks, gazing out the window. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening. But then, the door swung open with force. Laughter and heavy boots filled the diner. Edward didn't turn around, he didn't need to. He could tell by the sound of their voices, the way they moved, the deliberate way they claimed space, they were trouble. Bikers. At least 5 of them, leather jackets, steel-toed boots, and the kind of presence that demanded attention. They took over a large table near the counter, their loud conversation drowning out the gentle hum of the diner. Edward took a slow sip of his coffee, staying calm. He had faced far worse than a few loudmouths. But then, one of them noticed him. "Hey, look at this." A sharp whistle. Edward felt their eyes on him before he even turned his head. The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a scar across his cheek, leaned against the counter, smirking. "Didn't know we had a real-life action hero in town." The others chuckled. Edward ignored them. He wasn't looking for a fight. He had fought enough battles to last a lifetime. But the bikers had other plans. One of them, a younger guy with spiked blonde hair and an eager, mean grin, nudged the leader. "Think he's actually seen action? Or just one of those desk jockeys?" More laughter. Edward took another sip of coffee. The leader wasn't laughing. He was watching Edward closely, waiting for a reaction. And when he didn't get one, he decided to push harder. He took a slow step forward, resting his hands on Edward's table. "What's the matter, soldier?" Edward finally looked up. Their eyes met. For the first time, the leader hesitated. There was something in Edward's gaze, something steady, something unshakable. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse for men like him. It was indifference. The biker didn't like that. Not one bit. He forced a grin, tapping Edward's table with his knuckles. "Come on, buddy, lighten up. We're just having some fun." Edward set his coffee cup down, slow and deliberate. And then, in a voice that was calm but firm, he spoke. "I don't recall asking for company." The room went quiet. The waitress froze mid-step, sensing the shift in the air. The bikers exchanged glances. Then, the leader's grin widened. "Oh, he's got some attitude." He glanced at his crew. "You hear that, boys? The hero here thinks he's too good for us." One of the other bikers chuckled. "Maybe we ought to teach him some respect." Edward didn't move. He had faced armed men in combat zones. A few loud bikers in a diner? Hardly a concern. But he knew men like this. They wouldn't back down until they were forced to. And something told him. They had just made their first mistake. The tension in the diner thickened, like a storm building on the horizon. Edward didn't move. He had spent years learning how to control his instincts, how to measure a threat without overreacting. And right now, these bikers weren't a threat. Not yet. The leader, still smirking, pulled out a chair across from Edward and sat down, making himself comfortable. "Relax, soldier. We're just having a friendly conversation." Edward stared at him. No reaction. The leader's smirk faltered just slightly before he turned to his crew. "Man, I swear, these military guys got no sense of humor." The others chuckled. One of them, the blonde with the mean grin, leaned in over Edward's shoulder. Maybe he's one of those guys who signs up just for the benefits. You know, free college, cushy desk job. Never even seen a real fight. Edward kept his breathing slow and steady. The younger biker tapped his fingers on the table, pushing a little harder. That right, hero? Ever actually been in combat, or do you just play dress up? Edward finally set down his coffee cup. Slow. Deliberate. His eyes flicked to the blonde biker's hand, still tapping against his table. A fraction of an inch too close. A fraction of a second too slow. And that hand would be broken in 3 places before the biker even knew what happened. But Edward didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he looked back at the leader. Measured him. You talk a lot for someone who doesn't know a damn thing. The leader's expression darkened. A murmur rippled through the diner. Other customers had stopped eating. The waitress stood behind the counter, her hands trembling as she held a coffee pot. She knew this was getting bad. Edward knew it too. The blonde biker's grin faded, replaced with something colder. You got a smart mouth. He reached forward and grabbed Edward's coffee cup. Tilted it slightly. Hot liquid spilled across the table, dripping onto Edward's sleeve. A small offense. A test. The other bikers watched closely, waiting to see how the soldier would react. Waiting for him to flinch. Waiting for him to snap. Edward? He simply took a napkin and wiped his sleeve. Calm. Controlled. Unshaken. And that unnerved them. The leader leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Let me guess, soldier boy. You think you're better than us? You think just 'cause you wear that uniform, you get to walk in here and act like you own the place? Edward sighed. I came in here to eat. Not to listen to a bunch of amateurs try to act tough. A few bikers shifted uncomfortably at the word amateurs. The leader scowled. That's so. He turned to the blonde biker and nodded. That was all the signal he needed. The blonde lunged forward, gripping Edward's shoulder in a mockingly tight squeeze. Maybe we ought to see just how tough you are. Wrong move. Edward's body reacted before his mind even had to process the action. In one fluid motion, he snatched the biker's wrist, twisted it just enough to make pain shoot up his arm, and slammed his hand onto the table palm first. The diner fell into dead silence. The blonde sucked in a breath, face twisted in shock and pain. Edward tightened his grip slightly, his voice calm. Let me give you a piece of advice. He leaned in just a fraction. Don't start a fight you're not ready to finish. The leader stiffened. His eyes darted between his biker's trapped hand and Edward's steady grip. He could see it now. The control. The precision. Edward hadn't even broken a sweat. The blonde tried to yank his hand free, but Edward didn't let go. And at that moment, the gang finally understood. They had just made their first mistake. The blonde biker's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he struggled to free his wrist from Edward's grip. But Edward wasn't letting go. Not yet. His fingers pressed down, not enough to break the bone, but enough to send a clear message. The diner was dead silent. No more laughter. No more smug smirks. Just the sound of the biker's strained breathing and the quiet drip, drip, of spilled coffee onto the table. The leader's jaw tightened. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were supposed to get a reaction, a flinch, a moment of weakness, something. Instead, this soldier sat there, calm as a storm before it hits. And that pissed him off. Let him go. The words were measured, controlled, but there was an edge to them. Edward's eyes flicked up to meet the leader's. Unfazed. Still calm. Still unshaken. He's the one who grabbed me. A tense pause. The blonde groaned, his free hand gripping his forearm in a weak attempt to pry himself loose. Edward gave his wrist a quick, final twist, not enough to break, just enough to leave a bruising reminder, before finally letting go. The biker yanked his hand back, cradling his wrist like it had been caught in a steel trap. The rest of the gang shifted uneasily. This wasn't going according to plan. The leader's smirk was long gone. His fingers curled into tight fists, and Edward could see the war playing out behind his eyes. He had two choices now. Walk away, lose face. Or escalate. The leader chose wrong. You think you're real tough, huh? He shoved the table, making coffee cups rattle as he stood up. Edward didn't move. He didn't even blink. The leader leaned in, his voice dropping low. You've got no idea who you're messing with, soldier boy. Edward let the silence stretch, watching the leader's nostrils flare, his fists clench and unclench at his sides. And then, he spoke. You know what's funny? The leader's brow furrowed. Edward finally leaned forward, just a little. I've met men far more dangerous than you. Men who don't need a pack to back them up. Men who don't puff their chests and start fights in diners just to prove something. The leader's lips curled back in a sneer. But Edward wasn't finished. And do you know what happened to them? A pause. A slow, cold smirk crossed Edward's face for the first time that night. They're not around anymore. The leader froze. For the first time since walking into the diner, his confidence wavered. Edward saw it. The tiny flicker of doubt, the barely noticeable shift in his stance. The rest of the gang caught it too. A couple of them exchanged uncertain glances. Edward leaned back, rolling his shoulders like this whole thing was a waste of his time. And that was the final insult. The leader snapped. He swung. A fast, wild punch aimed right at Edward's face. And just like that, it was over before it even began. Edward moved like lightning. 1 second, he was sitting. The next, he was standing. His chair toppled back, and in one fluid motion, he caught the leader's fist midair. Effortless. Controlled. The leader's eyes went wide as Edward's grip tightened around his knuckles, a silent warning. The entire diner held its breath. And then, in a voice so calm it sent chills down their spines, Edward said, "That was your second mistake." For a moment, nobody moved. The leader's fist was trapped in Edward's grip, his knuckles straining under the pressure. The cocky bravado, the smug confidence, all of it drained from his face in an instant. His crew sat frozen, watching their leader's worst-case scenario unfold right in front of them. Edward hadn't even broken a sweat. The tension in the diner was so thick it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. And then, Edward squeezed just a little harder. A sharp crack echoed through the air. Not enough to break bone, but enough to send a clear, undeniable message. The leader let out a hiss of pain, his jaw clenching as he tried so hard, not to react. But his body betrayed him. His knees buckled just slightly, his muscles tensed involuntarily. And everyone saw it. Edward leaned in just a fraction, lowering his voice. "I gave you a chance to walk away." The leader's breath was uneven, his pride warring with his instinct to survive. Edward tilted his head slightly. "But now, you need to learn something about respect." The leader tried to pull his hand free. He failed. Edward's grip was unshakable. The leader's face twisted in frustration, in something dangerously close to fear. And that's when Edward saw it. That flicker in his eyes, not just pain, not just anger, but doubt. He realized, for the first time in a long time, that he wasn't the most dangerous man in the room. Edward could see the shift happening. The uncertainty. The way his own gang started looking at him differently. He had already lost. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it. The leader gritted his teeth, forcing a smirk despite the pain. "You think you're some kind of badass, huh?" Edward let out a slow breath, his grip relaxing just slightly. "Not as a mercy. As a warning. I don't think. I know." The leader lunged with his free hand, trying to sucker punch Edward in the ribs. But Edward was faster. He released the leader's trapped fist and, with blinding precision, caught his incoming punch mid-air. A perfect counter. A perfect lesson. In the span of a heartbeat, Edward twisted the biker's arm behind his back and slammed him down onto the diner table. The silverware rattled. Cups tipped over, spilling coffee everywhere. The entire gang shot to their feet, but none of them moved. Because in that moment, they saw it clearly. Edward wasn't just strong. He wasn't just fast. He was trained. His movements were effortless, precise, and lethal. This wasn't some bar fight. This was a professional handling an amateur. Edward bent down just a little, whispering so only the leader could hear. "This is the part where you realize you made a mistake." The leader growled, his face pressed against the cool surface of the table. His crew, silent. No one was laughing anymore. The waitress behind the counter covered her mouth, eyes wide with shock. And then, Edward let go. The leader staggered back, rubbing his wrist, his face twisted in humiliation. He opened his mouth, maybe to make a last attempt at regaining control. But Edward had already turned away. As if he wasn't even worth the effort. And that was the final insult. The leader's fists clenched. His face burned with rage, humiliation, and something he wouldn't dare name, fear. And as Edward took a calm sip of his coffee, barely acknowledging him, the leader finally understood. He had made a terrible mistake. The leader stood there, his chest rising and falling, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Edward, meanwhile, sat back down, calmly adjusting his sleeves as if nothing had happened. The diner was dead silent. Every single person inside had witnessed it. The gang leader, the man who walked in acting untouchable, had been handled like a reckless child. And that humiliation? It burned. The leader's crew still stood behind him, unsure, hesitant. The dynamic had shifted. They came in expecting domination. Instead, they got a lesson in power. The leader's breathing was heavy, rage boiling just beneath the surface. His pride screamed at him to do something, to regain control. He wasn't just going to sit back and take this. Not in front of his crew. Not in front of all these people. And then, he reached for a knife. A switchblade, pulled smoothly from his jacket. The blade flicked open with a metallic click, catching the light as he held it low, ready. Gasps filled the diner. Someone muttered, "Oh, hell no." Even his own crew looked uncertain. The blonde biker, his wrist still sore from Edward's earlier grip, took a step back. "Boss, maybe we just go." But the leader didn't hear him. His eyes were locked on Edward, full of pure fury. He needed to win this. He needed to take back control. And Edward? He simply stared at the blade. Not alarmed. Not impressed. Just tired. Because he had seen this exact scenario before, 100 times. And every single time, it ended the same way. Edward set his coffee down, slowly standing up. The leader's grip on the knife tightened. "You don't walk out of here without scars, soldier boy." Edward tilted his head slightly. His voice was calm, measured. "Put it away." The leader scoffed, taking a step forward. "Make me." Wrong answer. Edward moved. Fast. Before the leader could even process what was happening, Edward's hand clamped onto his wrist, hard. A split second later. Crack. The knife clattered to the floor as the leader let out a strangled cry of pain, his wrist twisted at an unnatural angle. The entire diner flinched. The blonde biker took another step back, his face pale. The leader fell to his knees, his face twisted in agony. Edward bent down slightly, his grip still firm, his voice so cold it sent a chill through the room. "You should have walked away." The leader panted, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. His crew stood frozen, not daring to move. Edward let go, and the leader collapsed onto his hands, breathing hard. The knife lay a few feet away, useless. The tension in the air was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, the waitress, who had been silently watching from behind the counter, finally stepped forward. She crossed her arms, looking down at the leader with an expression of disgust. "You're done here." The leader glared up at her, still cradling his wrist. The waitress didn't flinch. "Pick up your pride and get out." For the first time that night, the leader's crew didn't follow his lead. They looked at each other, at him, at Edward. And then they turned away. One by one, they walked out. No words. No fight. Just quiet shame. The leader, left alone, looked around the diner. Saw all the eyes on him. Saw the way people looked at him now. Not with fear, but with pity. Slowly, he forced himself up, his movements stiff, his wrists throbbing. He took one last look at Edward. Edward? He had already sat back down, completely uninterested. The leader clenched his jaw, swallowing his pride. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving behind nothing but silence. The diner remained silent, the tension hanging in the air like thick smoke. Edward picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip, as if nothing had happened. The waitress, still standing behind the counter, shook her head in disbelief. The gang was gone. The so-called toughest men in town had walked away with their heads down. And their leader? Broken. Humiliated. Forgotten. A man who once thrived on intimidation had been stripped of his power in front of everyone. And Edward? He hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't thrown a punch, except in self-defense. And yet, he had controlled the entire encounter. The remaining customers slowly breathed again, glancing at Edward with a mix of shock, awe, and deep respect. A man sitting near the counter, a blue-collar worker in his late 40s, gave a low whistle. Hell of a thing to watch. Edward didn't respond. He simply reached for a napkin and wiped the last few drops of coffee from the table. The waitress walked over, hands on her hips. She had seen her fair share of fights in this place. Drunks, punks, truckers who thought they owned the world, but nothing like this. She looked at Edward carefully, her voice soft. "You okay, Han?" Edward glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "Fine." She nodded slowly, studying him for a moment before picking up the empty plate in front of him. "Well, dinner's on the house. Least I can do." Edward shook his head. "No need." The waitress smirked. Wasn't a question. He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his wallet, dropped a few bills on the table, far more than what the meal cost. "For the trouble." She hesitated, then pocketed the money without another word. The rest of the diner slowly returned to normal. People whispered among themselves, some stealing glances at Edward, but no one dared to approach. And yet, just as Edward was about to leave, one voice cut through the quiet. A boy. Couldn't have been older than 10 or 11. He sat at a booth with his mother, eyes wide, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "Mister, are you a superhero?" The mother's eyes went wide. "Jason," she whispered sharply. "Don't bother the man." But Edward paused. He turned slightly, looking at the boy. Something in his expression softened. And then, for the first time that evening, Edward smiled. Just a little. "No, kid." He picked up his jacket, slinging it over one shoulder. "Just a soldier." The boy's eyes lit up. "A real soldier?" Edward nodded. The boy hesitated, then did something that no one in the diner expected. He stood up and saluted. A little awkward, a little unsure, but sincere. Edward stopped. He looked at the boy for a long moment, then, without a word, raised his hand and returned the salute. A perfect, crisp movement. The mother placed a hand over her heart, her eyes glistening. The blue-collar worker near the counter gave a small nod of approval. Even the waitress, who had seen it all, looked a little choked up. Edward held the salute for a second longer, then dropped his hand. He gave the boy one last look, then turned toward the door. As he stepped outside, the cold air felt different. Lighter. He had come here just looking for a meal. And somehow, he had left a lesson. For the bikers. For the diner. And maybe, just maybe, for himself. Because if there was one thing he had learned through years of service, respect isn't taken. It's earned. Edward stepped outside into the cold night air, breathing in deeply. The scent of rain lingered in the breeze, mixing with the faint aroma of diner grease and fresh coffee. The sky above was dark and endless, only a few scattered streetlights cutting through the shadows. For a moment, he stood still. The diner door swung shut behind him, muting the muffled voices of the customers inside. Inside, they were still talking about what had just happened. They'd talk about it for days, maybe even weeks. And Edward? He was already letting it go. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wouldn't be the last. But that was the way of the world, some men needed to be taught the hard way. Edward adjusted his jacket over his shoulders and started walking toward his truck. His boots hit the pavement in slow, measured steps, his mind already shifting back into the quiet. But then, a voice. Hey! He stopped. Turned. The leader of the biker gang stood a few yards away, just outside the alley beside the diner. His crew was nowhere to be seen. His wrist was still cradled against his chest, his face pale from the pain. But something was different. The cocky smirk, the arrogance, it was gone. Now, his expression was something else. Something closer to shame. Edward said nothing. Just waited. The leader hesitated, then let out a slow, shaky breath. I messed up. Edward remained silent, letting the man talk. The leader shifted, looking anywhere but at him. I thought I was proving something. Thought I was in control. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. But you showed me how wrong I was. Edward studied him carefully. He had seen this before, men who had to be broken down before they understood. Some never learned. Some came back stronger. Edward still didn't speak. Instead, he just nodded once. A simple gesture, but enough. The leader looked down at his injured wrist, then back up at Edward. You could have crushed me. Could have made an example out of me. Edward shrugged. Didn't need to. Another beat of silence. The leader exhaled, nodding slowly. Then, surprising even himself, he extended his good hand. A handshake. An offering. A sign that he understood. Edward considered it. This was his choice now. He could ignore it. Walk away. Leave the man to sit with his failure. Or he could give him a chance. After a long pause, Edward took his hand. The leader's grip was firm, but no longer trying to prove dominance. This time, it was just respect. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They let go, and the leader stepped back, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Guess I owe you a drink one day. Edward smirked just slightly. I don't drink with fools. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. Fair enough. Edward turned back toward his truck. The leader watched him for a second longer, then stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets and walked off, disappearing into the night. Edward climbed into his truck, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. As the headlights illuminated the road ahead, he took one last glance at the diner in his rearview mirror. Inside, people were still talking. The waitress was laughing softly with a customer. The young boy, the one who saluted him, was pointing excitedly to where Edward had been sitting. Edward let out a quiet breath. Some lessons were taught with words. Others, with actions. Tonight, he had taught one that wouldn't be forgotten. With a shift of gears, his truck rumbled forward, rolling away into the night. As he disappeared down the road, one final thought settled in his mind. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned.